They had already conquered 43 civilizations by the time the humans appeared on their charts, and not one of those conquests had required more than a demonstration of force and a carefully worded agreement. The Kynthian collective did not rush these things. They preferred to arrive with certainty, present terms that could not reasonably be refused, and allow the other side to come to the correct conclusion on their own. It was efficient, predictable, and for a very long time, it had never failed. The system designated Sol 3 had not attracted much attention at first. A quiet star, unremarkable energy output, a developing species that had only recently begun stepping beyond its own orbit. The preliminary reports classified the inhabitants as technologically capable but strategically insignificant. Their fleet was small, their influence non-existent, and their lack of alliances made them an ideal candidate for early integration. There was, however, a small note buried deep in the observational logs that did not fit the rest of the profile. It was not about their ships, or their weapons, or their political structure. It was about their behavior. Long-range surveillance had recorded human vessels encountering unknown objects at the edge of their system. In every other case the collective had studied, emerging species reacted to the unknown with hesitation, caution, or outright retreat. Humans did not. They approached. They scanned. They stayed longer than was considered safe by any standard model of risk assessment. In one instance, a vessel had maintained position near an unidentified anomaly for over 6 hours despite clear fluctuations in local space-time stability. The analyst who filed the report had marked it as anomalous curiosity behavior and moved on. No one had flagged it as important. By the time the diplomatic meeting was scheduled, the expectation was already set. This would proceed like all the others. The station at the edge of neutral space had been prepared, the terms had been finalized, and Ambassador Velker had reviewed the human file twice with mild disinterest. There was nothing in it that suggested resistance would be anything more than procedural. When the human delegation finally entered the chamber, there was no visible sign that anything about this meeting would be different from the dozens that had come before it. 3 individuals, unarmored, minimally escorted, carrying no visible indication of authority beyond simple insignia and quiet composure. They did not speak immediately. They did not look around in the way new species often did, trying to take in unfamiliar surroundings or searching for reassurance from one another. They simply walked to the table as if they had already decided how the room would be used before they arrived. Velker had seen confidence before. He had seen defiance, and fear disguised as pride, and the brittle calm of leaders who knew they were outmatched but refused to show it. This was not the same. There was no tension in their movements, no excess energy, no attempt to project strength. They looked like people who had already accounted for everything that could happen next. For a brief moment, Velker found himself studying the man at the front of the group more closely than he had intended. Commander Jake Harris, according to the file. Average physical metrics. No recorded enhancements. No notable deviations from baseline human physiology. And yet, there was something about the way he paused before sitting, the way his gaze moved across the room once and then settled, that suggested a level of certainty Velker could not immediately categorize. It was not arrogance. It was not ignorance. It was something else. Velker dismissed the thought almost as soon as it formed. He had been doing this for 30 years. Patterns did not change because of a single impression. Outcomes did not shift because of something as intangible as posture or silence. The meeting would proceed. The terms would be presented. The humans would evaluate their position and arrive at the only conclusion that made sense. They always did. Still, as the door sealed behind the delegation and the room settled into that familiar pre-negotiation quiet, Velker became aware of a small, uninvited question forming at the edge of his thoughts. If the outcome was as certain as it had always been, then why did it feel, just for a moment, like this time might take longer than expected? The formalities began exactly as they always did, with measured voices and carefully structured language that had been refined over decades of successful negotiations. Ambassador Velker spoke first, outlining the collective's position with the same calm authority that had ended conflicts before they had ever truly begun. The benefits were presented clearly: access to advanced technology, integration into established trade networks, protection under a unified military structure that had never been meaningfully challenged. It was a generous offer, by any reasonable standard. Across the table, the human delegation listened without interruption. Commander Harris did not take notes. The woman beside him, Lieutenant Cara Webb, held a tablet but did not interact with it yet. The third member, Sergeant Dan Cole, remained standing slightly behind them, positioned just off to the side in a way that allowed him a clear view of both the room and the only visible exit. Velker noted that detail, though it did not concern him. Many species placed their security personnel in similar positions during first contact negotiations. It was a reflex, not a strategy. When the outline of the agreement was complete, Velker shifted to the portion that mattered. In exchange, he said evenly, your civilization will be incorporated into the collective's governance structure. You will adhere to established legal frameworks, contribute economically through standard taxation, and provide military support when called upon. There was a brief pause, the kind that usually preceded questions, objections, or the first signs of resistance. Harris nodded once, as if confirming that he had heard exactly what he expected to hear. And if we choose not to accept these terms? He asked. The question was standard. The tone was not. There was no edge to it, no attempt to challenge or provoke. It sounded like a man asking for clarification on something already understood. Velker folded his hands on the table. Then the nature of the offer changes. In what way? It becomes less accommodating. That was usually enough. In past negotiations, this was the point where hesitation began to show. Delegates would shift in their seats, exchange glances with their advisors, begin calculating outcomes they had hoped to avoid. It was the moment where reality started to settle in. But nothing in the human delegation changed. Lieutenant Webb glanced briefly at Harris, not for guidance, but as if confirming alignment. He gave a barely noticeable tilt of his head in response. Sergeant Cole did not move at all. Harris leaned back slightly in his chair, not retreating, but adjusting into a more comfortable position. I want to be sure I understand, he said. You're asking us to give up independent governance, accept external taxation, and commit our personnel to conflicts we may not agree with. In exchange for the advantages outlined, yes. And if we decline, you apply pressure until we reconsider. Velker allowed himself a faint, controlled smile. You could describe it that way. The room remained quiet for a moment. From the perspective of the collective, the situation was simple. The humans had no leverage. Their fleet numbers were insignificant compared to even a single Kynthian strike group. Their territory held no strategic advantage that would complicate enforcement. They had no allies who would intervene on their behalf. Every variable pointed to the same conclusion. They would accept. Velker had seen this stage many times before. The moment where a species began to understand that resistance was not a viable option, only a temporary delay. The tone would shift soon. It always did. The questions would become more practical. The focus would move from refusal to negotiation of minor terms that allowed them to preserve dignity while still complying. He waited for that shift. It did not come. Instead, Harris placed his hands on the table and looked directly at him, his expression unchanged. We're open to cooperation, he said. Trade, shared security, information exchange. There's a lot we can build together. Velker inclined his head slightly, recognizing the transition. Then we are in agreement. Harris continued as if he had not spoken. But we're not going to sign anything that removes our ability to make our own decisions. And we're not going to send our people to fight in conflicts they didn't choose. There was no emphasis on the words. No raised voice. No visible resistance. Just a clear statement. One of the Kynthian advisors along the wall shifted his stance slightly, the movement subtle but noticeable in the otherwise still room. Velker did not look at him. His attention remained on the man across the table. He had heard refusals before. Many of them had sounded stronger than this one. Many had been delivered with passion, conviction, even desperation. Those refusals had not changed the outcome. You are confident, Velker said after a moment. Harris considered the word briefly. We're informed. The distinction was small, but it landed differently than expected. Velker leaned back in his chair, studying him more carefully now. There was still no sign of stress in the human delegation. No tightening of posture, no increase in movement, no indication that they fully grasped the imbalance of power between them. Or perhaps, no indication that they were concerned by it. The thoughts surfaced again, sharper this time, but still without enough substance to hold on to. Velker dismissed it. The data was clear. The collective's position was unassailable. Whatever this calm was, it would not survive the next stage of reality. It never did. You will have time to review the terms, he said, sliding a data chip across the table. 48 cycles. I suggest you use them carefully. Harris looked at the chip for a moment, then picked it up and set it beside his hands without examining it. We will, he said. He stood, and the others followed without hesitation. No final remarks. No attempt to extend the conversation. Just a quiet, controlled exit. The doors closed behind them with a soft, mechanical seal, and the room returned to stillness. For a few seconds, no one spoke. Then one of the advisors exhaled lightly. Standard resistance posture, he said. They'll review the terms, adjust expectations, and return ready to finalize. Velker nodded once. That was the logical outcome, the expected outcome. And yet, as he reached for his notes and began to record the session, he found his attention drifting, not to what had been said, but to what had not. No hesitation, no visible calculation, no moment where the weight of the situation had settled in. Just that same steady composure from beginning to end. He wrote his report anyway, marking the humans as cooperative but unrealistic, and noted that a demonstration of force would likely accelerate compliance if necessary. The process was intact. The pattern was unchanged. But somewhere beneath that certainty, the earlier question remained, no longer vague, no longer easy to ignore. If they truly understood their position, then why hadn't anything about them shifted at all? The 48 cycles passed without incident, at least from the perspective of the station logs. Routine operations continued, patrol routes remained unchanged, and no unusual signals were recorded in the surrounding sectors. To anyone reviewing the data, it appeared to be a standard waiting period between initial contact and final agreement. Velker expected a message before the deadline. Most species did not use the full time once they began to understand their position. They reached out early, seeking clarification, requesting minor adjustments, preparing the ground for acceptance. The humans did not. There were no questions, no follow-up transmissions, no attempts to renegotiate through indirect channels. Their silence was complete. It was not the silence of uncertainty. Velker had seen that before. Uncertain species filled the gaps with activity, with nervous communication, with visible effort to regain control of a situation they did not understand. This was different. It was as if the decision had already been made. When the request for a second meeting finally arrived, it came on the last cycle, precisely within the window that had been given. The message was brief, containing no additional information beyond the request itself. Velker approved it immediately. He told himself there was no reason to interpret the delay as anything unusual. Some species required time to process the implications of integration. Some took longer to align internal leadership before responding. Still, as he prepared for the meeting, he found himself reviewing the human file again, not for strategic data, but for behavioral patterns. There was very little there. No extended diplomatic history. No prior negotiations at this scale. No consistent model of how they handled pressure from more advanced civilizations. It was, in a way, an absence of information. The second meeting began the same way as the first. The doors opened. The same 3 individuals entered. The same measured pace. The same lack of visible tension. But now Velker was watching more closely. Commander Harris did not look around the room this time. He had already seen it. His attention moved directly to the table, to the positions of the chairs, to the placement of the advisors along the walls. He adjusted his seat slightly before sitting, angling it just enough to maintain a clear line of sight to both Velker and the entrance behind him. It was a small movement, easy to overlook. It was also deliberate. Lieutenant Webb took her place beside him, setting her tablet on the table without activating it immediately. Her posture was straight but relaxed, her focus directed forward, not down. She was not preparing to react. She was waiting. Sergeant Cole moved to his previous position near the edge of the room. He did not lean against the wall. He did not shift his weight unnecessarily. He stood as if the position itself had been chosen for a reason that did not require adjustment. Velker became aware, as he observed them, that there was a pattern forming in their behavior. Nothing was wasted. Every movement served a purpose, even if that purpose was simply to avoid creating unnecessary signals. He began the meeting without acknowledging the thought. "You have reviewed the terms," he said. Harris nodded once. "We have. And your decision?" A brief pause followed, not long enough to be hesitation, but long enough to indicate that the answer was being delivered with intent. We are not accepting the agreement as written. There was no reaction from the human delegation beyond the words themselves. Across the room, one of the Kinthian advisors shifted again, this time more noticeably. Velker did not look at him. His attention remained fixed on Harris. Then you understand the implications of that decision, Velker said evenly. We do. Yet you have chosen to proceed regardless. Yes. The exchange was simple, direct. It carried none of the emotional weight that usually accompanied a refusal at this stage. Velker leaned forward slightly, studying him. On what basis, he asked, do you believe you are in a position to decline? Harris did not answer immediately. He glanced once at Lieutenant Webb. This time, she responded. She activated her tablet and turned it slightly so that the display was visible across the table, but she did not push it forward yet. We think the conversation is incomplete, she said. Her voice was calm, precise, and entirely without hesitation. In what way? Velker asked. There are variables that have not been fully considered. Velker allowed a small pause to settle into the room. You are suggesting our assessment is incorrect. We are suggesting it may be incomplete. Again, the distinction was subtle. Velker sat back, his expression unchanged, but his attention sharpening. Then perhaps you should clarify. Harris placed his hands on the table, fingers loosely interlaced, and for the first time since the meeting began, there was the slightest shift in the atmosphere, not from tension, but from focus. We're not here to reject cooperation, he said. We're here to make sure that whatever we build is based on an accurate understanding of both sides. Velker did not respond immediately. There it was again. Not defiance. Not negotiation in the traditional sense. Something more controlled. He realized, as the moment stretched slightly longer than expected, that the humans were not reacting to the structure of the meeting. They were guiding it. The thought settled in quietly, without urgency, but with enough weight that it could not be dismissed as easily as before. Across the table, Harris remained still, waiting, not for permission to continue, but for the right moment to do so. And for the first time since the process had begun, Velker found himself considering a possibility he had not needed to consider in a very long time. That the outcome of this meeting might not be determined solely by the terms he had brought into the room. The shift did not happen all at once. It began with something small enough that it could have been dismissed if Velker had not already been paying closer attention than usual. Lieutenant Webb turned her tablet fully toward the center of the table, and this time she did slide it forward, stopping it within clear view, but not forcing it into the space as an aggressive gesture. The screen displayed a structured set of data, organized in a way that suggested careful preparation rather than improvisation. Velker glanced at it briefly, expecting projections, trade models, or some attempt to negotiate terms from a weaker position. It was none of those. What you're looking at, Webb said, is a comparative baseline. Velker's gaze returned to the display, more focused now. The data was arranged in columns, multiple species, each with metrics listed in precise detail. Physical capacity, endurance ranges, recovery timelines, structural resilience under stress. It was not unfamiliar information. The collective maintained extensive biological records on all integrated species. What drew his attention was the final column. Human. At first glance, the numbers did not appear dramatically different. Variations existed, but nothing that would immediately justify the tone the humans had taken during the conversation. Velker looked up. I'm not seeing anything here that alters the strategic balance, he said. Harris nodded slightly, as if the response had been expected. That's because you're looking at the data the way it's usually presented, he said, as isolated metrics. There was no challenge in his voice, no attempt to correct, just a statement. Velker's eyes narrowed slightly, not in irritation, but in concentration. Then explained the relevance. Harris did not speak immediately. Instead, he glanced once at Webb. She adjusted the display with a simple gesture, reorganizing the data. The columns shifted. The relationships between the numbers became clearer, not as individual values, but as ratios. Comparisons. Relative differences. Velker leaned forward slightly despite himself. Your species, Harris said, originates from a planetary gravity of approximately 6.1 meters per second squared. Velker gave a small nod. Correct. Ours is 9.8. The number itself was already in the file. It had not been considered strategically significant. Until now. For your population, Harris continued, 6.1 is baseline. Every physical system, every biological process, every movement your people make is calibrated to that environment. Velker said nothing. He was listening now in a way he had not been during the first meeting. For us, Harris said, 9.8 is baseline. There was a brief pause, just long enough for the implication to begin forming before it was fully stated. That difference doesn't just affect strength, Webb added. It affects endurance, structural density, cardiovascular output, long-term fatigue resistance. It changes how stress is absorbed and how quickly recovery happens. Velker's gaze returned to the display. The numbers had not changed. His interpretation of them had. One of the advisors along the wall shifted position, stepping slightly closer to see the screen more clearly. No one told him to move back. That alone, Velker said after a moment, does not offset the disparity in fleet capacity. Harris inclined his head slightly. We agree. The response was immediate. No hesitation. No attempt to overstate their position. It made the next part land harder. But it changes the cost calculation, Harris said. The room grew quieter. Velker did not look up this time. His attention remained on the data, tracing the relationships between values that had previously seemed insignificant. You're presenting this as a deterrent, he said. No, Harris replied. We're presenting it as context. Another small distinction. Velker exhaled slowly through his nose, a controlled, measured breath. He straightened slightly, regaining a more neutral posture. Even if your assessment is accurate, he said, the collective's advantage remains decisive. Harris did not respond immediately. For the first time, he allowed a slightly longer pause to settle into the space between them. Not long enough to disrupt the flow of conversation, but long enough to draw attention to what would follow. We're not saying you couldn't win, he said. The phrasing was careful, deliberate. We're saying the outcome wouldn't look the way your models predict. Velker's eyes lifted from the table. That was new. Not resistance. Not defiance. A reframing. Behind him, one of the advisors spoke for the first time since the meeting had begun. On what basis are you making that claim? Webb adjusted the display again. This time, additional data appeared. Performance under sustained stress, injury tolerance thresholds, extended operational capacity without rest. Velker felt something shift, not in the room, but in his own evaluation of the situation. It was not a realization yet, not a conclusion, just the beginning of a discrepancy. These are projections, the advisor said. Models. They're not projections, Webb replied. They're measured. The words settled differently. Velker's fingers tapped once, lightly, against the surface of the table before becoming still again. He was no longer evaluating whether the humans were wrong. He was evaluating what it would mean if they were right. Across from him, Harris remained exactly as he had been since the beginning of the meeting. Calm, composed, entirely without urgency. Not pushing, not insisting, just allowing the information to exist in the space between them. And for the first time since the humans had entered the process, Velker became aware of something he had not accounted for in his initial assessment. The possibility that the imbalance he had relied on so completely might not be as absolute as he had believed. It did not begin as part of any strategy. There was no formal escalation, no directive issued by the collective, and no signal from the human delegation that anything had changed. The negotiations had paused for the cycle, both sides returning to their routines with the understanding that discussions would continue once further internal reviews were complete. The incident started at the edge of the neutral zone, far enough from the station that it should have remained irrelevant to the talks. A Kynthian patrol vessel detected a human ship operating near a boundary marker that was, according to the patrol captain's interpretation, slightly out of alignment with agreed positioning. The readings were ambiguous. The margin was small. It should have been verified. It was not. The decision to intercept was made quickly, based on incomplete data and the assumption that the situation would resolve itself the way it always did, with compliance. The human vessel was not a warship. Its configuration identified it as a survey craft, designed for mapping and data collection rather than engagement. It carried no visible weapons systems and transmitted no defensive signals when the patrol ship approached. From the Kynthian perspective, there was no reason to expect resistance. 8 soldiers were deployed through the airlock. They entered in full armor, weapons ready but not raised, expecting the usual response. Hands visible, posture lowered, immediate submission once the presence of force was established. Instead, they found a single human standing in the central corridor. Sergeant Dan Cole. He was not wearing armor. He had no visible firearm. In his right hand, he held a compact baton, extended but resting at his side rather than raised in defense. He did not step back when they entered. He did not speak immediately. The corridor was narrow enough that the soldiers had to adjust their formation slightly as they moved forward. The lead soldier issued a command through the translation system, instructing him to stand down and comply with the boarding procedure. Cole's gaze shifted briefly toward the embedded translator panel, acknowledging the words, and then returned to the soldiers. "This vessel is operating within neutral space," he said, his voice level. "You don't have authority to board." There was no increase in volume. No urgency. Just a statement. The lead soldier took another step forward, raising his weapon slightly, not fully aimed, but positioned to enforce compliance if necessary. "Stand down." Cole did not move. "Leave the way you came," he said. "We can call it a navigation error." The moment stretched. From the Kinthian perspective, the outcome was already decided. One unarmored individual against a trained boarding unit. The presence of resistance did not alter the conclusion, only the process. The lead soldier closed the distance. What happened next unfolded too quickly to align with expectation. Cole moved first. Not backward. Forward. The baton came up in a controlled arc, striking the inside of the soldier's weapon arm before the trigger could be fully engaged. The angle was precise. The impact redirected the weapon without attempting to overpower it. In the same motion, Cole stepped past the first soldier, using his position to break the line of sight from the others. The formation collapsed. What followed was not chaotic. It was structured. Cole did not engage each opponent individually. He moved through them, repositioning constantly, forcing them into each other's space, preventing coordinated response. His movements were efficient, without wasted motion, each action transitioning directly into the next. One soldier went down, then another. A third attempted to adjust position and was redirected into the corridor wall with enough force to disrupt balance without causing immediate incapacitation. Cole was already moving before the impact completed. Strikes landed on him as well. One connected cleanly with his side. Another glanced off his shoulder. A third made direct contact with his upper torso. He did not stop. There was no visible hesitation, no break in rhythm, no indication that the impacts had altered his capacity to continue. The engagement lasted 4 minutes and 32 seconds. When it ended, 6 Kinthian soldiers were on the floor, conscious but unable to continue. 2 had retreated back through the airlock, sealing it from the other side. The corridor was quiet. Cole stood where the last movement had ended, his breathing elevated but controlled. There were visible injuries, cuts along his forearm, discoloration forming beneath the surface of his skin where impacts had landed. He did not examine them. He looked once toward the sealed airlock, then turned and walked to the communication panel. "Cole to Harris," he said. The response came almost immediately. "Go ahead. We had a boarding attempt. 8 personnel. Ship is secure." A brief pause. "Status. Minor injuries. Nothing that affects function." Another pause, shorter this time. "Understood. Hold position. We're contacting the station." Cole ended the transmission and remained where he was, his posture returning to stillness as if the preceding minutes had not required adjustment. The footage from the ship's internal cameras was transmitted automatically as part of the incident report. It reached the station within the hour. Velker reviewed it in private. He watched the entire sequence once without interruption. Then again. The second time, he paused at specific moments, points where the movement did not align with expectation, where impacts occurred without producing the expected outcome, where positioning shifted in ways that suggested pre-calculated awareness rather than reactive adjustment. He did not speak while watching. When it ended, he remained seated for several seconds, his attention fixed on the final frame. 1 human, 6 armored soldiers on the ground. He initiated a direct call to his chief military advisor and had him review the footage. The advisor watched it in silence. When it finished, he did not immediately comment. His eyes remained on the frozen image, as if attempting to reconcile what he had seen with established understanding. "The technique," the advisor said finally, "is advanced. But that is not the primary issue. Velker did not look away from the screen. No, he said quietly. The advisor continued, more carefully now. The impacts he absorbed should have ended the engagement. At least reduced effectiveness. There was no measurable degradation. Velker's fingers tightened slightly against the arm of his chair, the movement subtle but deliberate. He continued as if they were irrelevant. Neither of them spoke for a moment. The silence that followed was not confusion. It was recalculation. Velker leaned back slowly, his gaze still fixed on the image. For the first time since the humans had entered the process, the question was no longer whether they had been underestimated. It was how much. The footage did not leave Velker's thoughts when the screen went dark. It followed him into the next cycle, into the quiet intervals between briefings, into the moments where his attention would normally shift to routine matters without effort. This time it did not. He had seen combat recordings before, hundreds of them. He understood how to read movement, how to identify training patterns, how to separate skill from circumstance. What he had watched in that corridor did not fit cleanly into any category he was familiar with. It was not just efficiency. It was continuity. There had been no hesitation between actions, no visible recalibration after impact, no moment where the human had needed to recover control of the situation. Every movement flowed into the next as if the outcome had already been mapped before the first strike landed. That alone would have been notable. It was not the most significant part. Velker initiated a direct communication channel. Commander Harris responded without delay. Ambassador, your soldier, Velker said. Is he operational? There was no pause on the other end. Yes. Not recovering. Not under observation. Operational. Velker allowed a brief silence to follow, not as a tactic, but as a way to measure the response. He engaged 8 trained personnel, Velker said. Unarmored. He did, and sustained multiple direct impacts. Yes. Velker shifted slightly, his posture straightening as he moved to the question that mattered. Is that level of performance typical within your military? There was a pause this time. Short. Measured. Not hesitation, evaluation. When Harris spoke again, his tone had not changed. Sergeant Cole is good at his job, he said. But he's not considered exceptional. The words settled into the space between them with more weight than anything that had been said in the previous meetings. Velker did not respond immediately. He had expected a qualification, a clarification, some indication that the event represented an outlier, an edge case that did not reflect the broader capability of the species. It did not come. Not exceptional, Velker repeated. Correct. The implication was clear. What he had seen was not the upper limit. Velker ended the call without adding anything further. There was no need for additional confirmation. The answer had already expanded beyond the question he had asked. He requested the data file again. Not the summary. The full comparison. Lieutenant Webb's presentation from the previous meeting had been structured for clarity, but it had not been exhaustive. Velker accessed the deeper layers now, the raw metrics, the extended observations, the long-term studies of human physiology under varying conditions. He read through it once. Then again, patterns began to emerge, not as isolated advantages, but as a system. Bone density that reduced fracture probability under impact thresholds that exceeded standard combat parameters. Muscle fiber distribution that allowed sustained output without rapid degradation. Cardiovascular capacity that supported prolonged exertion beyond expected fatigue curves. Neural response patterns that maintained function under stress levels that typically impaired coordination in other species. And beneath all of it, something less quantifiable but consistently present. Adaptation. Not a single trait, but a convergence of many, shaped over time in an environment that had not favored stability. Velker leaned back slowly, the tablet still active in his hands. The data did not describe a species optimized for comfort. It described one optimized for persistence. He thought back to the earlier conversation, the gravity differential, the emphasis on baseline conditions. At the time, it had seemed like context. An interesting detail, but not a decisive factor. Now it connected. A higher gravitational environment did not simply increase strength. It increased the cost of every movement, every action, every moment of exertion from the beginning of a species' development. To function within that environment required systems that could sustain that cost. To evolve within it required systems that could exceed it. Velker became aware, gradually, that his initial framework for evaluating the humans had been incomplete, not because the data had been missing, but because it had been interpreted through the wrong lens. He had measured them against the collective's baseline. They had never shared that baseline. The discrepancy was not in their capabilities. It was in the assumptions used to assess them. He stood and moved to the viewport, the station rotating slowly beneath him as distant stars shifted in a quiet arc across the glass. Somewhere beyond that field of light was a planet he had previously categorized as unremarkable, a stable orbit, manageable atmospheric conditions, no extreme anomalies that would complicate habitation. That classification no longer held. A world that required its dominant species to operate under constant physical strain, to endure environmental pressures over extended evolutionary timeframes, would not produce a species that aligned with standard projections. It would produce something else, something that did not break in the same places, something that did not stop at the same thresholds. Velker closed his eyes briefly, not in frustration, but in acknowledgement. The question was no longer whether the collective could impose its will if necessary. The question was what that imposition would require. He returned to the table and activated the communication channel again. Harris answered. Ambassador, I've reviewed your counterproposal, Velker said. A brief pause, and I will consider it as a viable basis for further discussion. Another pause, slightly longer this time. That's all we're asking, Harris said. Velker allowed himself a moment before responding. He had spent 3 decades entering negotiations with certainty of outcome, of structure, of the direction each conversation would take. For the first time, that certainty had shifted, not disappeared, but changed. I think, Velker said carefully, we may need to continue this conversation with a different set of assumptions. Agreed, Harris replied. The line closed. Velker remained standing for a moment, his attention returning briefly to the viewport before settling back into the room. The data had not changed. The humans had not changed. Only his understanding of them had. And with that change came a realization that carried more weight than any individual statistic or recorded event. The collective had not encountered a weaker civilization resisting integration. They had encountered a civilization that had been measured incorrectly from the very beginning. The next meeting did not feel like the previous ones. Nothing in the room had changed. The same table, the same lighting, the same quiet hum of the station's systems running beneath the surface of everything. The structure was identical, but the weight of the space had shifted in a way that did not need to be spoken aloud. Velker noticed it before the humans entered. His advisors were more attentive, their movements more deliberate, their focus no longer resting on the assumption of outcome, but on the details of the process itself. 2 senior council members had joined this session, an adjustment that would not have been made if the situation were still considered routine. That alone was enough to confirm what Velker had already concluded. This was no longer a formality. When the doors opened, the human delegation entered as they always had, controlled, unhurried, without any outward indication that the balance of the conversation had changed. If anything, that consistency made the difference more apparent. They had not adjusted. The room had. Harris took his seat, aligning it with the same precise angle as before. Webb placed her tablet on the table, already active this time, her attention focused but not fixed. Cole remained near the edge of the room, still as ever, his presence now carrying a different weight, not because he had changed, but because everyone else had. Velker began without delay. We have reviewed your proposal, he said. Harris gave a small nod. And there are elements we find acceptable. The words were measured, but their significance was not. No one in the room reacted visibly. That, more than anything, confirmed the shift. Velker continued. There are also elements that require clarification. The structure you are proposing does not align with existing collective frameworks. We expected that, Harris said. There was no satisfaction in his tone, no sense of advantage being pressed, just acknowledgement. Velker studied him for a moment. You are asking for equal standing, he said. Shared authority, mutual agreement before any coordinated action is taken. Yes, that is not how the collective operates. I understand. Another pause. Velker leaned slightly forward, his attention narrowing, not as a display of control, but as a reflection of genuine focus. Then explain why you believe it should. Harris did not respond immediately. He let the silence settle, not as pressure, but as space. Because anything built on imbalance doesn't last, he said finally. It holds for a while, sometimes a long while. But eventually, the side carrying less weight starts looking for ways to remove the structure entirely. There was no accusation in the statement, no implication of threat, just a simple observation. Velker felt the weight of it more than he expected. You're suggesting that integration under current terms would create instability, one of the senior council members said. I'm saying it wouldn't be sustainable, Harris replied. And your alternative is? A structure where neither side can force the other into something they don't agree with. Velker glanced briefly at the council members beside him. There was no immediate objection, no interruption. That alone would not have happened in the previous meetings. The conversation continued, moving through specific clauses, adjusting language, refining definitions. Trade agreements were established quickly. There was mutual benefit there, and both sides recognized it without resistance. The discussion of military cooperation took longer. The collective's framework relied on hierarchy. It always had. Decisions flowed from the top, enforced through structure and scale. It was efficient, proven, and until now, unchallenged. The human proposal did not reject cooperation. It rejected unilateral control. At one point, one of the advisors spoke again. You're asking us to limit our own operational authority, he said. Harris shook his head slightly. I'm asking you to build something neither of us can break alone. The distinction landed. Velker sat back, his hands resting lightly on the table as he considered the statement. For the first time, the conversation was not about what the collective could take. It was about what it could build. And more importantly, what it might lose by choosing the wrong approach. The image from the corridor surfaced again in his mind. One human, 6 soldiers on the ground. Not exceptional. He thought about the data Webb had presented. The biological differences, the endurance, the adaptation. He thought about the way Harris had sat through every meeting without a single unnecessary movement, without any visible sign of strain, as if the pressure that would have shifted other species simply did not apply in the same way. And then he thought about something else. Cost, not just in numbers, in time, in resources, in unpredictability. The collective could win a conflict. That had not changed. But the shape of that victory no longer fit the models he had relied on. And for the first time in his career, Velker found himself asking a question he had never needed to ask before. Not can we enforce this? But should we? The answer came not as a sudden realization, but as a gradual alignment of everything he had seen, everything he had reviewed, everything he had previously dismissed. He reached for the document on the table, the human proposal, refined through hours of discussion, and looked at it for a moment longer than necessary. Then he activated his stylus. The room went completely still. He wrote a single notation at the top of the document in the formal script of the collective. It was concise, precise, and carried a weight that did not require elaboration. Accept it as a basis. He turned the document and slid it across the table. Harris looked down at it, reading the notation without visible reaction. After a moment, he gave a small nod. Not victory. Not relief, just acknowledgement. The tension in the room shifted again, this time releasing rather than building. Velker leaned back slightly, his gaze steady. This does not conclude the process, he said. There are still details to finalize. Of course, Harris replied. But it changes the direction. Harris met his gaze. That's the point. Velker allowed a brief silence to settle, then inclined his head once. For the first time since the humans had entered the process, the outcome was no longer something being moved toward through pressure. It was something being built. And more importantly, something the collective had chosen, not because it had to, but because it had finally understood the alternative. The agreement was not finished that day. It took 11 more cycles to complete, each one quieter than the last. Not because the discussions had become easier, but because they had become more precise. There were no wasted arguments, no attempts to force conclusions that did not hold. Every clause was examined from both sides, not as a point of leverage, but as something that would have to function long after the people in the room were gone. Velker found the process unfamiliar. Not difficult, just different. In previous negotiations, resistance had been something to overcome, a barrier to move through on the way to a predetermined outcome. Here, it was something else entirely, something that refined the structure rather than delaying it. The final document reflected that difference. Trade access was open and balanced, structured in a way that allowed both civilizations to expand without dependency. Information sharing was clearly defined, with safeguards that ensured neither side would lose control of what they provided. The section on military cooperation had taken the longest, but it was also the most deliberate. No forced deployment, no unilateral commands, no scenario in which one side could commit the other without consent. It was not the collective's usual model. It was not supposed to be. On the final cycle, the council chamber was prepared once more. There were fewer observers this time. No need for demonstration, no need for scale. The significance of what was happening did not depend on how many people were present to witness it. Velker stood at the table as the human delegation entered. The same individuals, the same controlled movement, the same absence of anything unnecessary. But now, the room responded differently to their presence. Not with tension, with recognition. Harris took his place across from him, the document already positioned between them. Webb stood slightly to his side, reviewing the final version one last time without speaking. Cole remained near the edge of the room, still as ever, his role unchanged, his presence now fully understood. Velker placed his hand on the document, not signing yet, just resting there for a moment as he looked across the table. When this process began, he said, we believed we understood what we were negotiating with. Harris did not interrupt. Velker allowed a small pause. That assessment was incomplete. There was no resistance in the admission, no attempt to soften it, just accuracy. Harris gave a slight nod. That happens. Velker almost smiled at that, not out of amusement, but at the simplicity of the response. He activated the interface. The document finalized under his authorization. Harris followed, his own confirmation appearing alongside it. There were no speeches, no formal declarations, just the quiet completion of something that had not existed before. Velker extended his hand across the table, repeating a gesture he had observed earlier in the process. Harris took it without hesitation. The contact was firm, brief, and entirely without ceremony. Good work, Harris said. Velker inclined his head slightly. On both sides, the room began to empty. Advisors moved out first, already discussing implementation details in low voices. Webb and one of the Kinthian economic analysts remained for a moment longer, exchanging information about initial trade routes as if the agreement had simply been a step towards something ongoing. Cole left without a word. Harris paused at the doorway, just long enough to look back once. Not at the table, not at the document, but at the room itself, as if marking it for reference rather than reflection. Then he was gone. Velker remained. He moved to the viewport slowly, the station rotating beneath him as the stars shifted in their distant patterns. The neutral zone stretched out beyond the glass, no longer just a boundary, but a point of connection. Somewhere beyond it was a planet he had once categorized as minor, a system he had believed would follow a familiar path. He understood now that the error had not been in the data. It had been in the assumption that all species followed the same progression. Earth had not. It had produced something shaped by constant pressure, by conditions that did not allow weakness to remain untested, by a history that had forced adaptation not as an advantage, but as a requirement. And that had changed everything. Velker thought briefly of the note he had written after the first meeting, a recommendation for a demonstration of force to ensure compliance. He let the memory settle, then set it aside. That outcome had never truly existed, not in the way he had imagined it. He turned from the viewport and gathered the finalized documents for the next stage of coordination. There was already a follow-up session scheduled, focused on the first joint convoy moving between human and collective space. It would not be the last. As he left the chamber, Velker found that the earlier question, the one that had formed at the edge of his thoughts during the first meeting, had finally resolved itself. The outcome had not taken longer than expected. It had simply required understanding something that had not been visible at the start. And now that it was, the conclusion felt inevitable, not because the collective had enforced it, but because, in the end, both sides had seen clearly what the alternative would have cost. Far from the station, on a quiet world under a heavier sky, Commander Jake Harris sat alone for a while after returning home, looking up at the stars the way he always had. There was no sense of victory in the moment. No need for it. The work had been done. And somewhere out there, beyond the distance, a civilization that had once seen humanity as something small had learned, without being forced, exactly what it was dealing with. Not unstoppable, just understood.